You are all, by being here, part of a really wonderful tradition of Americans showing up in the middle of a snowstorm or a heat wave or whatever to get together and talk about public affairs. Alexis de Tocqueville, back in 1830, came to the US from France to study the American prison system. And he ended up staying and writing probably the single most influential book about American politics and American culture, Democracy in America. And one of the central ideas of democracy in America is the importance of self-rule, and especially self-rule at the local level. And he talks about the spirit of associations, or as I guess he would say in French, l'esprit of associations. And that's what we have right here. We're a small group, but we kind of represent together the spirit of gathering to talking about issues that matter to our community. Where Tocqueville leaves off, I pick up. Tocqueville mostly talks about what I call ordinary politics or mainstream politics. I pick it up at what happens when ordinary politics doesn't work well enough. So as I was thinking about this, I was kind of reflecting on Plato's allegory of the cave. I think it really captures something that's really important for us to think about as we adjust our minds to the strange, upside-down, topsy-turvy, uncertain, chaotic environment that we now live in. Imagine being in a cave, and there's a group of people sitting in the front of the cave, and they're looking at a wall. And they're kind of chained down so that they can't move. Their heads are fixed so they can't look off to the side. They have no peripheral vision. They can only look forward. And when they look forward, they see on the cave walls these changing forms. And the changing forms are shadows that are created by the movement of different shapes in front of a fire. So these people who are sitting in the cave looking at these forms kind of flickering across the screen, if you will, they think that that's reality. And so what happens to the people who are in the cave is that at some point somebody releases them and lets them go out of the cave, and they venture into the bright light of the out of doors, and they don't know what they're seeing anymore. It's like their life has been turned upside down. And they resist it. They resist freedom because it's not what they are used to. And when they go back into the cave to tell the other people who are still fastened to these chairs in front of the wall watching the flickering images, they don't believe it, and they think that there's something evil or dangerous about not being tied to the chair and looking up at these fake images. They think the fake images are more real than anything that they can encounter outside the cave. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because there's so much misinformation going on. There's so much inability to kind of separate fact from fiction. There's so much people kind of instinctively, reactively deciding on a narrative. And then when they see a new narrative with their own eyes, they're taught not to believe their own eyes. Don't believe your own eyes. Pay attention to what's on your screen. Pay attention to the forms that are moving across in front of you. And I think our real challenge in this day and age is to find a way to see things differently. No matter where we are on the political spectrum, we need to find a way to see things differently, to kind of turn ourselves upside down so that we have a new perspective and so that we have an independent way of judging what's there. And one of the things that I kind of want to challenge us all to do is to rethink what not only American democracy is now, but what it's always been. We were taught over the years that American democracy is stable, that it's based on the consent of the governed, that there's a rules-based society, a law-based society that is stable, that is reliable, that we live in an international order that, although highly flawed, still works in a lot of ways. And I think what we've been discovering in recent years is that a lot of that isn't necessarily so. Over the course of the last several years, especially since the pandemic, I've kind of had a lot of my own assumptions challenged about how the world really works and about what the basis of politics really is and about how change really can happen. And this book is a result of that rethinking. And I came to a conclusion: activism is a central part and has always been a central part and needs to stay a central part and become a bigger, more central role in American politics. And when you look back over the history of American politics, you see that activism is responsible for virtually every advance of democracy that there has ever been. Here's how I start the book. Let's play a thought experiment. What would America be like without activism? Well, there would be no movement toward mass enfranchisement. There would be no movement against slavery. There would be no movement for women's suffrage. There would certainly be no movement for labor rights. There would be no movement for the environment, and we could go down the line. Virtually every expansion of democracy in American history happened not because the lawyers got together, not because the legislators got together, not because even people like us and nice associations like this got together, but because troublemakers got together. People who wanted to challenge the fundamental beliefs and mores and practices of society. They wanted to make, in the words of John Lewis, good trouble. In my book, I identify 15 specific rules of activism. And the idea is that if you want to change the world, you don't have to follow every one of the 15. It's not a checklist. But you have to at least consider how they might fit into your agenda. And so I want to talk today about 3 rules in particular, which I think are, in my mind anyway, the most foundational. The first one, rule number 1, is connect, listen, and share. To talk about this one, I want to bring us to Baltimore in the early 1980s. Young organizer named Arnie Graff comes to Baltimore to help revive this organization called BUILD. And what he found was kind of a broken down, fragmented, disconnected organization lacking in energy. Now, the way that Arnie Graff always operated, whenever he went to a new city, and he had previously worked in San Antonio, New York, Washington, D.C., and also Chicago, where he worked with this young organizer named Barack Obama. Wherever Arnie Graff went, all he did for months was talk to people and ask them what mattered to them. He would go to a minister or a local business person or a local elected official or someone on a school board or a principal, and he would say, what matters to you? I have no agenda here, no agenda whatsoever. Just tell me, or what are the issues? What are the hopes? What are the dreams? What are the agendas that you would like to pursue? At the end of the meeting, he would say, okay, now, if there was a disaster at 2 o'clock in the morning, who would you call who you could definitely depend on? And then they would tell him who that was, and then he would go see that person. And then he would go to that person and say, who would you call at 2 o'clock in the morning? Well, one of the persons that he was told by many, many people to go see was a little church lady, elementary school teacher named Marion Dixon. And he went to see Miss Dixon. She only agreed because, as a favor to the priest, I'll talk to you. And so he goes to her living room, he talks to her, and she says, now I have to tell you, I don't do politics. I'm not interested in politics. I'm a teacher. And he said, I understand, but you still care about your community, right? And she said, yes, I do care about my community. So I said, okay, well, let's talk about it. And at the end of their conversation, he said, can we talk again? This was really fantastic. And she said, well, we can, but I'm not really interested in politics. And he said, I understand. I just want to learn a little bit more from you. And he started to learn about her past. And she was an African American. And she grew up in St. Mary's County, which is a small, kind of isolated tobacco fishing community, 60 or so, 70 miles south of Washington, D.C. And St. Mary's County was a deeply, deeply segregated community. And she told about the time that she went to the church and she asked her sister, hey, why do we have to sit in the back? And he said, well, that's where the Negroes are supposed to sit. And she said, that's not right. I said, yeah, well, that's just how it works. And so she said, well, I'm not sitting here, I'm going up front. So she goes up front, caused a big stir in the congregation. Finally, the deacons came over, they said, Marion, you're not allowed to be here. And she said, but I want to be here. And then the priest came out and she said, Marion, you know, the way it works is you're not supposed to sit here. Negroes go in the back. And she said, but I can't hear you. And he said, well, I'll talk louder. She said, no, I want to stay here. Finally, the deacons carried her to the back. Next week, she goes straight for the front. Deacons come, they carry her back. Next week, sits in the front, deacons carry her back. Finally, they gave up. So young Marion Dixon desegregated this church in very, very deeply segregated St. Mary's County. And this is when Arnie knew that he had something on his hands. Finally, he asked her, would you be willing to go to an action? An action is the term that is used for some kind of direct encounter with someone in power. You have an agenda, you have an issue you want to raise, and you raise it directly with the person of authority. And you demand that they give you an answer or a schedule or a plan or a process in order to deal with that issue. And she said, well, you know, as I told you, I don't do politics. And he said, yeah, I know, but you don't have to do anything, just watch. So she goes, and the topic in that particular occasion was boarding up buildings in Baltimore. Baltimore had this incredible abandonment in the 70s and 80s. Gangs and drug dealers were using them as their place to do business, and they would kind of take planks off the side of the house and burn them. At the end of this meeting, after pressing, the housing authorities agreed to an experiment for changing the way they boarded up buildings so that they would not be used for firewood, so they would last for a longer time. And Marion walks out of that meeting and said, man, we've been trying to get something done for like a half a year, and you guys do it in one meeting. This is really incredible. So that went on, and finally Arnie said, would you be willing to lead an action? And she's petrified at that, but by this time she's into it, and she realizes that this is a real formula for not only learning what people want and what they need, but also learning how to talk to people in power. And so they happened to have a meeting with Mayor William Donald Schaefer, or Mayor Annoyed, because that's what always the headline was in the Baltimore Sun, Mayor Annoyed. She was at the meeting with Mayor Annoyed, and they were kind of pushing their agenda. He was pushing back. Mayor Schaefer was the classic old-style bully. And at one point in this meeting, this is Arnie Graff telling me this, at one point in this meeting, Melonhead is getting red. And she puts his hand on his hand and said, you know, that's not good for you. And so by the end of the meeting, though, they had another meeting with him, and they ended up resolving these issues satisfactorily. End of the story. Marion Dixon ends up being the president of BUILD, which is now the most powerful grassroots force in the city of Baltimore. There's not a politician in Baltimore who does not feel obliged to go before the BUILD group with hundreds of people showing up at these meetings with clear agendas of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. They have guarantees for employment if you graduate from high school, healthcare, housing, a whole variety of issues that they've managed to make real progress on as a result of BUILD, led for many years anyway by Marion Dixon, the little church lady who was not interested in politics. She doesn't do that. I love this story because it tells the power of listening. It's interesting. There's a lot of words for talking in politics, lobbying and buttonholing, and of course the name parliament comes from the French word parler, to speak. But there's no political words for écouter, for listening. But listening is probably the single most powerful skill that you can develop in politics. And Arnie Graff and his organization, they build everything they do around what they call one-on-ones or relational meetings, which is how Arnie met Miss Dixon way back when. That's rule number one for me. Before you do anything, don't presume you know anything about the community that you're going into. Make a concerted effort to listen, share, follow up, and then also ask, who do you call at 2 in the morning if you need help? Rule 8 is about creating a multi-dimensional strategy. Now, strategy refers to the kind of overarching plan that you have. It's not the specific actions you take. A strategy is not to go into a meeting with Mayor William Donald Schaefer. That's a tactic. That's how you pursue a strategy. Strategy is the big blueprint. I also like to think about it as kind of a hypothesis. If we do this, and this, and we combine them in a certain way, we're going to be able to transform the way people talk about politics, the way people act in politics, and the results that we get. Strategy is the big picture guide. It's the North Star that helps you get from one place to another. I like to think of strategy as having 4 key elements. And if you have all 4 of them, and if you combine a bunch of tactics using these 4 elements, these 4 dimensions of strategy, chances are you're going to be successful. You're at least going to make movement forward. And the 4 dimensions are time, space, force, and mind. And I think they're self-explanatory, but I'll say a word or two about each. Time is simply, where does it happen? What is the duration of it? Are you going for a quick knockout, or are you going for a long-term trench warfare where you develop power over time, slowly, methodically, patiently? And it also has to do with the timing of specific actions that you take. When do you strike? What's the best moment? What's the most propitious moment for confronting William Donald Schaefer? There's a good time for doing it and a bad time for doing it. There's an effective time and an ineffective time. So that's time. Space. What is your arena? Are you going to be focusing on a small neighborhood? Are you going to be focusing on the row houses on 37th Street in Baltimore, Maryland? Or are you going to talk about the whole neighborhood? Or are you going to talk about that whole section of Baltimore that goes from Johns Hopkins University to Lake Montebello? Or are you going to talk about the whole city? Or are you going to talk about the whole county? Or the whole state or beyond, right? What's the scope of conflict? What's the geographic scope? That makes a big difference, because the key thing for any kind of political activity is to find the pressure points. If you go too big, you're going to diffuse whatever power you have. If you go too small, then you lose the ability to have a big impact right away. So you have to force. How do you confront people? Do you confront people to persuade them, or to block them, or to take away their authority, or to embarrass them, or to prevent them from doing something, or what? So how much force do you want to get? Are you going to be polite, or are you going to be not so polite? Are you going to be Martin Luther King at the March on Washington, giving a beautiful speech that rallies people and that presents the best image of the movement to the nation as a whole? Or are you going to be the Martin Luther King of Birmingham, where the whole point was to instigate conflict so that the rest of America saw on the evening news that night policemen with cattle prods and fire hoses knocking down teenage girls and boys as they're trying to speak up for their own rights? King himself was not violent, but he knew that his actions, the team's actions, would provoke violence. So there's another question of force there. And then mind. How do you persuade people? How do you get people to think? Ultimately, people act depending on how they think the world works and what they can do and what they can't do. Time, space, force, mind. So I wanted to illustrate this. I want to talk about one of the all-time great movements in American history, which is the organizing of the United Farm Workers by Cesar Chavez in the 50s and 60s, and actually into the 70s as well. In the early 1960s, organizing the farm workers in the Central Valley of California was a disaster. Not only was Chavez trying to organize unions to bargain for wages for the pickers, other unions were competing. There was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of dislike among these competing unions, and so they constantly undermined each other. Not only that, even if they had worked together, which they eventually did, what they could do was really limited. When workers signed up to be part of a union, they were fired and replaced by braceros. Or when companies agreed to bargain, they would go out of business and then they would reappear under a different corporate name. So they would dissolve their company, and then a new company would come in, and so whatever progress had been made disappears instantly. And of course, workers who were involved in organizing were terrorized. They were kicked out of their homes. They lost their jobs. Their families were in danger. Organizing has never been easy in America. The US has a long history of repression of organized labor. So what are they going to do? Well, there's this guy named Jerry Brown, not the Jerry Brown you're thinking of, a graduate student at Cornell University. And Jerry Brown had an idea. He said, look, we keep losing these local skirmishes. We can't win them. Even when we win them, we lose them. So let's change the scope of the battle. Let's make the battle national and even international. Cesar Chavez says, okay, how do you suppose we're going to do that? Boycott grapes. Across the world, boycott grapes. This takes the battle from these small little communities where even when you win, you turn around and you lose, and it expands it to every shopping market in the country. If you can get consumers to not buy grapes, the grape growers will come under incredible pressure, and they will have to accede to the demands of the pickers. Not only that, they'll have to do it across the board, so that you don't have one farm that's unionized and then 2, 3, 4 more that are ununionized. And you're not having the workers fighting against each other. Everybody is on the same plane. So they radically expanded the scope of the conflict. They changed place, time, space, force, mind. They changed the space. And then they also changed the time, because when you do these localized conflicts, it only really works for a certain part of the year. So there's about 2 or 3 months when the workers have their only leverage. And then besides that, the other 8, 9 months of the year, they have no leverage whatsoever. And so there's a huge dead space between organizing efforts. And so this makes it year-round. It makes it national and even international. The boycott moved to Canada, and then it moved to Europe. It also changed the mind part of it, because all of a sudden, middle-class people who go to the grocery store to buy a bunch of grapes are suddenly aware of something that they weren't aware of before. They can't quite picture it, but they know that there's a righteous cause that they could never take part in. They could never play a constructive role if it was confined to the little communities of Central Valley in California. And so it became a big deal. Actually, it was one of the first political movements I learned about when I was a kid growing up in the 1970s. And it transformed the whole movement. It gave it a national and even an international constituency. Robert Kennedy became very close to Cesar Chavez, and he became a big supporter of it. He held the hearings, Senate hearings, out in California, which brought more media attention to the issue. And so it dramatically transformed it in that way. And then also with regard to mind, the United Farm Workers were an amazing group in cultural ways as well. They had a theater, they had musical groups, and they were also highly spiritual. Cesar Chavez, when they did a march to the state capitol in Sacramento, he didn't call it a march, he called it a pilgrimage. And he organized it for the Easter season so that they would arrive in Sacramento on Easter Sunday. And they carried crosses, and they quoted scripture, and they made the argument a deep moral argument, which trumped in many ways the kind of dollars and cents arguments most prominent in the whole issue for so many years. So time, space, force, mind. Force, the boycott itself is one of the ultimate kinds of force. It's taking something away from somebody else. It's saying, we're not asking you, we're going to force you to deal with us. We're going to coerce you to deal with us. What you're doing is you're influencing people. You're giving them information about what happens to their consumer dollars. And do you wish to use your consumer dollars to support an exploitive industry, or do you wish to support the workers who are keeping America fed? So the United Farm Workers transformed when they changed their strategy, changing how they thought of time, space, force, and mind. The result was that the union was not only recognized across the board and not only realized historic pay increases and benefits, but it led to a California state law for labor protections that became a national model. As you might know, farm workers are excluded from American labor laws. And so labor unions don't have what meager protections there are, and they don't have a process at all for organizing labor unions. And so this movement, this decision to go national, to go big, by changing time, space, force, and mind in the strategy, transformed the movement, and in many ways, the impact of this goes far beyond the grape workers themselves. So I want to talk about one other rule, rule number 11. It's withdraw consent. And I think it's probably the single most important because it gets at the very nature of what politics is all about. And my favorite thinker on this is a guy named Gene Sharp, who was really the great intellectual of nonviolent direct action in the years after World War II. And I actually got to know Gene a little bit when I was living in Boston. His operation was based in Cambridge. He started at Harvard, and then he moved off-site. I did a paper for him at one point. But what he did was study every nonviolent movement that he could get information on over all of history, going back to the Romans and the Greeks. And he developed this amazing catalog of how dissent happened over history, all over the world. And his main conclusion was that anybody can topple any authoritarian or dictatorial or repressive regime by withdrawing consent from the regime. Every regime depends on the consent of their people. Now, we might think of consent being peculiarly American or Western or democratic, but in fact, consent is absolutely essential to maintain the rule of the Milosevic's of the world, the Shahs of the world, the Maos of the world, and so forth down the line. If people do not agree to what's going on, and if they pull back their support, it starts to crumble. Every regime depends on people being good, little, obedient creatures. And that's what keeps the machinery going. And so withdrawing consent is the ultimate tool to use to confront any kind of noxious situation. Think back to American Revolutionary period and think back to the Boston Tea Party. The British had just enacted a new tax law on importation of tea to the Massachusetts colony. Now, what happened was it was not an anti-tax demonstration, by the way. That's how it's usually depicted in school books. Actually, the British had just drastically lowered taxes on tea, but they did it to give a monopoly to the British Tea Company. And so over the years, tax policy and tax refusal has become a really important tool for resistance, for withdrawing consent. But I don't think it's been powerful enough. Usually, tax revolts take place within ordinary processes of politics, like, for example, Proposition 13 in California, which reduced the maximum allowable property tax increases, or Proposition 2.5 in Massachusetts shortly thereafter, which did the same thing. But these are all very kind of ordinary processes. Tax refusal, though, is a different story, where people refuse to pay the taxes that they're legally required to pay. In recent years, it's mostly been used to protest against wars. It was a big way of protesting the Vietnam War, and it's also been a way of protesting Reagan's wars in Central America and the Bush wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it didn't make much difference, to tell you the truth. But I think it can make a difference, and let me give you two scenarios for how that might be. Scenario number one, Washington, D.C. What's on the license plates of Washington, D.C.? Does anybody know? Taxation without representation. Washington, D.C. pays higher rates of taxes than anybody in America, and they don't have a single vote in Congress. Their population is greater than 10 states, and they don't have a single representative, or at least voting representative, in Congress. The Republican Party in Washington wants to set up a tax protest against the lack of representation for the residents of Washington, D.C. I think it's a great idea. If these wealthy, affluent people who are kicking in billions into the federal treasury, if they say, not this year, not till we get a vote, they're going to have an impact. That's idea number one. Idea number two, what's going on in this country right now? There is this incredible campaign by ICE, the immigration authorities, to not just get the baddest of the baddest, which was the idea, or at least the idea that was sold originally by the Trump administration, but to really go after anybody who looks like they might be an immigrant, whether they're a 5-year-old child or a grandmother or someone picking up his kids at school or someone looking after a loved one in the hospital, whatever it is, they send in these guys wearing masks, carrying semi-automatic guns, masks, you can't see who they are. They grab people, throw them in a van, no warrant, no cause of arrest. They put them in jail. Sometimes they go without seeing a lawyer for days or even weeks. They are prevented from talking to their loved ones, from getting on the phone and saying, hey, I'm all right. There is talk now in some of these places where ICE has been active of organizing a tax protest to put real leverage on the federal government. Now, I have to say, what people in Minneapolis have done is really incredible. They've shown up in sub-freezing temperatures. They've gotten their cell phones out. They've taken pictures. They've confronted the ICE officers. They've chased the ICE officers on a couple occasions to get them the hell out. They've resisted in all kinds of ways, and that's very positive. The real strategy for it has to be much more multidimensional. Time, space, force, mind. They need force. If someone can organize a real tax protest among communities that have been subject to this invasion, it could be a game changer. It would be hard, it would be dangerous, it would be risky. What's needed in this moment is really a way to force that issue in as nonviolent a way as possible, to force the issue so that those ICE guys think twice, the people who are deploying them think twice, so that it goes from being a situation of maximum, untrammeled, unchecked force on one side to making that action impossible or at least highly difficult on the other side. I think what's going on right now is I think people are inventing a new chapter in political activism. And I see some really positive things happening. One thing we do know is that people in formal roles of authority are mostly sitting down on this one. There was a screening recently of the new Melania movie at the White House, and all the tech bros, and I'm sad to learn Tony Robbins and other people showed up. Amazon paid Melania $40 million to get preferential treatment from the government. Those folks, Tim Cook and Tony Robbins and Bezos and those guys, they're not going to solve the problem. It looks like Congress isn't going to solve the problem. So who is going to solve the problem? It's got to be people like Minnesota, and it's got to be potential tax activists, and it's got to be civil dissidents who simply, like Martin Luther, say, here I stand, I can do no other. One last point. This oftentimes feels like a really grim business, and it is a grim business. It's hard stuff. It's life and death in many cases. But one thing I want to leave you with is that it is also a deeply spiritual kind of activity. And one thing that the civil rights people taught me when I was researching my book on the civil rights movement and the March on Washington is the power of song and the power of culture and the power of arts to keep the thing going. The Birmingham campaign was going on in 1963, and when the fire hoses were being used and the cattle prods were being used on men, women, and children, and when homes were being firebombed, they would retreat to the church and they would have their sermons and they would have their rallies, and they would always end up in music. And you have to kind of see it to know how incredibly fulfilling and how kind of energizing and how courage-giving, is that a word? How courage-giving it can be. And when you listen to these old songs, Nobody Turned Me Around, This May Be the Last Time, We Shall Overcome, this is how people sustain themselves. And you look at other movements, the labor movement, Which Side Are You On, right? And a lot of Pete Seeger songs. All these songs created an energy and a spirit and a movement that kept things together and kept people realizing that there was more to it than the grim business of fighting. There was also this process of coming together, which made their lives much more full, much more complete than staying home and letting the news make itself ever could.